The scent of hot iron and lavender filled Alara Vance's small studio apartment. It was the smell of creation, the alchemy of turning raw fabric into something with a story. Sunlight streamed through the large industrial window, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny fairies over bolts of linen, silk, and cotton stacked against one wall. Her cat, a gray tabby named Stitch, was curled on a pile of soft merino wool, his tail twitching in his sleep. This was Alara's world, a fortress of her own making, crammed into a 400-square-foot walk-up in the city's arts district. She stood at her cutting table, the smooth, cool surface of a dark floral silk spread before her. This was the centerpiece of her new collection, Persephone's Garden. The design was her own, a digital print of pomegranates, narcissus, and weeping willows that seemed to bloom from the shadowy depths of the fabric. It was a tribute to the myth, to the duality of light and dark, of life and the underworld. But more than that, it was a tribute to her grandmother, Anemone. Her grandmother had been a seamstress, a woman who could coax magic from a needle and thread. She had taught Alara that every garment should have a secret, a small piece of its soul known only to the creator and the wearer. For Anemone, it was always a tiny, embroidered flower hidden on an inner seam. For Alara, it was something different. Her secret was woven into the very structure of her pieces. She called it the anemone stitch. Leaning over her sewing machine, she demonstrated the motion to herself, a familiar comfort. It was a modified lock stitch, almost imperceptible unless you knew exactly where to look. On the 7th stitch of every major seam, she would manually guide the thread to create a minuscule loop, a tiny, intentional imperfection that resembled the stamen of a flower. It was her signature, her fingerprint. It was a whisper of her grandmother's name in every piece she made. It was invisible, unbreakable, and entirely hers. The Persephone dress was nearly complete. It was a wrap dress, elegant and flowing, with bishop sleeves and a long, trailing sash. It had taken her weeks of sketching, draping, and stitching. Her entire collection was self-funded, the product of countless hours working a part-time barista job and pouring every spare dollar into fabrics and supplies. This collection felt different, though. It felt like a breakthrough. The designs were stronger, her vision clearer. She had already received interest from a small, high-end boutique downtown, the kind of place that could put an independent designer on the map. After carefully pressing the final seam, she hung the dress on a mannequin in the corner. It was breathtaking. The dark, romantic fabric clung and flowed in all the right places. It was more than a dress, it was a feeling. It was the culmination of her grief for her grandmother, her love for her craft, and her hope for the future. That evening, exhausted but fulfilled, she collapsed onto her sofa, scrolling idly through her phone. Her social media feed was a blur of curated lives and fleeting trends. She followed a handful of major fashion influencers, not out of admiration but for market research. One of them, a woman named Bianca Vale with over 10 million followers, had just posted a new photo. Alara's thumb froze. Bianca was posed on a sun-drenched balcony in Paris, a champagne flute in her hand. But Alara didn't see the Eiffel Tower in the background or the professionally applied makeup. All she saw was the dress. It was a wrap dress with bishop sleeves. The fabric was a dark floral. The pattern wasn't identical, but it was unnervingly close. The same pomegranate motifs, the same melancholic color palette. The cut, the drape, the way the sash tied, it was a ghost of her creation. A cheap, soulless echo. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She tapped on the photos tag. The dress was from Avara. Of course it was Avara. The fast fashion behemoth was notorious for its ability to replicate runway looks and get them into stores within weeks. They were a corporate shark, swallowing trends whole and spitting out polyester copies. The caption read, "Feeling like a goddess in the new underworld bloom dress from at Avara. Obsessed is an understatement." Avara fashion Parisian vibes, nausea coiled in her stomach. It wasn't just a similar idea. It was a copy. A sloppy, rushed copy, but a copy nonetheless. How could they have seen her design? She hadn't even released the professional photos yet. Then she remembered. A few weeks ago, she had posted a single, dimly lit work-in-progress photo to her private Instagram story, a fleeting glimpse for her 200 followers. Had that been enough? Had one of Avara's trend vultures been lurking? For the next hour, she fell down a rabbit hole of rage and disbelief. She went to Avara's website. There it was, the Underworld Bloom dress, the centerpiece of their new Mythos collection. It was selling for $49.99. Her version, with its pure silk fabric and meticulous construction, would have to retail for at least 10 times that to be profitable. The comments on Bianca Vale's post were a torrent of heart emojis and proclamations of "I need this now." The dress was already sold out in 2 sizes. The violation was a physical ache. They hadn't just stolen a design, they had stolen her story. They had taken her tribute to her grandmother and turned it into a cheap commodity, a disposable piece of polyester destined for a landfill. The intimate, personal language of her work had been twisted into a vacuous marketing slogan. Her first instinct was to scream into the void of the internet. She typed out a furious post, her thumbs flying across the screen, accusing Avara of theft, of plagiarism, of corporate greed. But something stopped her. An image of her grandmother, calm and deliberate, her fingers guiding fabric under the needle, flashed in her mind. "Measure twice, cut once," she used to say. Reacting in anger is like sewing with a tangled thread. Alara deleted the text. She needed a plan. The next morning, armed with a large coffee and a grim sense of purpose, she began her campaign. She found Avara's corporate contact information and sent a polite but firm email outlining the situation. She attached side-by-side photos, her design sketches, the photo of her finished dress on the mannequin, and a screenshot from Avara's website. She requested that they cease production and sale of the infringing garment immediately. The response she received 24 hours later was a masterpiece of corporate non-communication. It was a generic message from a no-reply address, thanking her for being a valued member of the Avara community and assuring her that their design team draws inspiration from a wide variety of global trends and historical sources. It was a polite, legalistic middle finger. She tried calling their corporate headquarters. After navigating a labyrinthine automated phone system, she was put on hold for 45 minutes before being unceremoniously disconnected. Frustration was beginning to curdle into despair. She felt like a gnat buzzing around the head of a rhinoceros. What could she possibly do? She was a one-woman operation working out of her apartment. They were a multinational corporation with a legal department the size of a small army. She thought about Ben Carter. He was a freelance journalist who ran a small but respected blog called The Ethical Thread. He specialized in investigative pieces about the fashion industry, exposing everything from poor labor practices to environmental damage. He was known for championing the little guy. With trembling hands, she drafted an email to him attaching all her evidence. She didn't know if he would even read it, but it felt like her only option. She was casting a message in a bottle into a vast, indifferent ocean. A week passed with no word from Ben. The Avara dress was now fully restocked on their website and featured in a massive digital ad campaign. Alara saw it everywhere, on billboards, in pop-up ads, on other influencers. Each time it was a fresh stab of pain. Her own collection sat in her studio, gathering dust. The boutique that had shown interest was now hesitant, worried about being associated with a design that was now synonymous with a fast fashion giant. Then the letter arrived. It came via courier, in a stiff, intimidating envelope bearing the logo of a top-tier law firm. Her name was printed in sharp black ink. Her hands shook as she tore it open. It was a cease and desist letter. But it wasn't from her to them. It was from Avara's lawyers to her. The legalese was dense and suffocating, but the message was clear. They accused her of defamation, of making false and malicious claims with the intent to harm Avara's business and reputation. They claimed their Underworld Bloom dress was the result of an independent and documented design process. They demanded a full retraction of any claims she had made, even though she hadn't made any public statements yet, and a signed agreement that she would never speak of the matter again. If she failed to comply within 48 hours, they would pursue all available legal remedies to the fullest extent of the law. The sheer audacity of it stole her breath. They were bullies. They had stolen from her and were now threatening to crush her for daring to even think about fighting back. The fear she had been holding at bay washed over her, cold and paralyzing. They could ruin her. They could bury her in legal fees until she had nothing left. She sank onto her stool, the letter rattling in her hand. This was the moment of truth. She could sign their letters, swallow her pride, and watch them profit from her heart and soul. She could let them erase her, or she could fight. Her gaze fell upon the Persephone dress, still standing sentinel on its mannequin. She walked over to it and ran her fingers along a sleeve seam. She felt for the seventh stitch, the tiny familiar loop. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory, not a ghost but a presence. There's strength in the small things, Avara. In the stitches nobody else can see. They had copied her design, but they didn't know its secret. They didn't know its soul. They had underestimated her, and they had underestimated her grandmother. The fear didn't vanish, but something else rose to meet it, resolve. It hardened in her chest like a diamond. They had picked the wrong fight. She picked up her phone and searched for intellectual property lawyers. She scrolled past the big corporate firms, the ones Avara would have on retainer. She looked for someone smaller, someone who, like Ben Carter, fought for the underdog. The name Marcus Thorne caught her eye. His website was simple, his biography direct. He had a history of representing artists, writers, and independent creators against large corporations. His office was a 20-minute subway ride away. She booked a consultation for the next day. Then she opened her laptop and pulled up her business's Instagram page. She took a deep, steadying breath and began to type. She didn't write in anger. She wrote with a cold, clear purpose. My name is Alara Vance. I am an independent fashion designer. Last month, the global corporation Avara released a dress that is a direct copy of my original design, the Persephone dress. I have tried to resolve this privately, but instead of addressing my claim, Avara has threatened me with legal action to silence me. I will not be silenced. She attached a series of images, a photo of her original sketch, a picture of her finished dress, and a screenshot of Avara's product page. The triptych was damning. For a long moment, her finger hovered over the post button. This was it. The point of no return. Once she did this, the battle would be public and she couldn't take it back. She thought of the letter from Avara's lawyers, its arrogant, threatening tone. She thought of her grandmother's hands, nimble and strong. She closed her eyes and hit post. The match was lit. The world would see if it cast a light or burned her to the ground. Marcus Thorne's office was not what Alara had expected. It was not a sleek, glass-walled tower, but a cluttered, book-lined room in a creaky old building. It smelled of old paper, leather, and strong coffee. Marcus himself was a man who seemed to belong to another era. He was in his late 50s, with a shock of unruly gray hair, round glasses, and a tweed jacket that had seen better days. He looked more like a university professor than a high-powered lawyer. He peered at the cease and desist letter through his spectacles, his brow furrowed. Well, they're not subtle, are they? He murmured, his voice a gravelly baritone. This is a classic intimidation tactic. The Goliath roars at David to scare him off the field strategy. Alara sat stiffly in the worn leather chair opposite his desk, her portfolio clutched in her lap. Can they do it? Can they ruin me? Marcus leaned back, steepling his fingers. They can certainly try. A lawsuit like this is a war of attrition. They have inexhaustible resources. They can file motion after motion, bury us in paperwork until you're broke and exhausted. Their goal isn't to win in court, it's to make sure you can never get there. He paused, his gaze sharp and intelligent. They're counting on you to be scared. The question is, are you? Alara thought of the post she had made the night before. She had turned off her phone notifications before going to bed, terrified of what she might wake up to. I'm terrified, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. But I'm also angry. This is more than just a dress, Mr. Thorne, call me Marcus. And I believe you, he gestured to her portfolio. Show me everything. For the next hour, Alara laid out her case. She showed him her dated sketches, her fabric receipts, her time-stamped digital design files. She explained the personal significance, the connection to her grandmother. Finally, with some hesitation, she showed him the anemone stitch. She brought a small fabric sample and a needle, demonstrating the tiny, deliberate loop. Marcus took the sample and examined it closely. Remarkable, he said, looking up at her with a newfound respect. A hidden signature. It's poetic. But is it provable? I don't know, Alara said. I've never told anyone about it. It was just for me. But if they copied my actual dress, If they used your physical garment as a template instead of just knocking off the design from a photo, then your little stitch might just be our smoking gun, Marcus said, a slow smile spreading across his face. It elevates this from a standard substantial similarity case to one of direct, literal copying. That is much, much harder for them to defend. He stood up and began to pace the small office. Your social media post was a bold move. It's a double-edged sword. You've drawn a line in the sand, but you've also opened yourself up to their narrative that you're an opportunist chasing fame. He stopped and looked at her. From this point forward, you say nothing publicly without running it by me first. We need to control the story. Avara will come at you with everything they have. They'll dig into your past, your finances, your education. They will try to paint you as a fraud. The thought was chilling, but Marcus's confidence was infectious. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of hope. So you'll take the case, she asked. Marcus stopped pacing and gave her a wry smile. Odemes. Vance, I've spent the better part of my career fighting corporate bullies. It's my favorite pastime. On a pro bono basis to start, with my fee contingent on a settlement. How does that sound? Tears of relief pricked Alara's eyes. Thank you, she managed to say. Don't thank me yet, he warned. This is going to be a long, hard road. Go home, get some rest. And maybe, he added with a twinkle in his eye, you should turn your phone on. I have a feeling the world is starting to talk. He was right. When Alara finally dared to look at her phone on the subway ride home, it was like a dam had burst. Her post had exploded. It had thousands of likes, shares, and comments. The hashtag #Avara stole my design was starting to trend. The support was overwhelming. Fellow designers, textile artists, and small business owners shared their own stories of being ripped off by corporate giants. It was a chorus of indignation, a collective roar from the Davids of the world. But there was a dark side, too. The comments on Avara's and Bianca Vale's pages were a cesspool of vitriol directed at her. She was a clout-chasing nobody, a talentless hack trying to get a payout. Bianca Vale herself had posted a smirking Instagram story saying, "So sad when people try to tear down success. The dress is fabulous, and I stand with brands like Avara that make fashion accessible for everyone." The battle lines were drawn. The noise was deafening. Alara felt dizzy, caught in a whirlwind she had unleashed. As she walked into her apartment, her phone buzzed with an email. The subject line was the ethical thread. Her heart leaped. It was from Ben Carter. He had seen her post. He had read her original email. He wanted to tell her story. The first interview with Ben Carter was a nerve-wracking affair. He met Alara at a small, quiet coffee shop far from her neighborhood, a neutral ground he suggested to make her feel more comfortable. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps in his early 30s, with kind, observant eyes and an air of calm that immediately put her at ease. He didn't come with a camera crew or a flashy recorder, just a small notebook and a pen. I don't want to put words in your mouth, he said after they'd ordered. I just want to listen. Tell me about the dress. Tell me about your grandmother, and so she did. She spoke for almost 2 hours, the words pouring out of her. She talked about the texture of her grandmother's calloused fingers, the smell of the steam from her iron, the quiet hum of the old sewing machine that now sat in Alara's studio. She explained the myth of Persephone and how it mirrored her own feelings of creating beauty out of grief. For the first time, she was telling the whole story, not to a lawyer, but to someone who understood that this was about art, not just commerce. Ben listened patiently, his pen scratching occasionally in his notebook, his questions thoughtful and precise. When he finally published the article a few days later, it was everything she could have hoped for. Titled The Anemone's Sting, How Avara's Latest Trend Cost One Designer Her Heritage, the piece was a masterclass in narrative journalism. Ben had woven her personal story together with a sharp, well-researched critique of the fast fashion industry's predatory practices. He included quotes from intellectual property experts and other designers Avara had allegedly copied in the past. He didn't just report the facts, he captured the heart of the issue. The article was a bombshell. It was shared by major publications, by celebrities who championed sustainable fashion, and by thousands of people who were fed up with corporate exploitation. It gave her case a legitimacy and a platform that her Instagram post alone never could have. Public opinion, which had been a chaotic mix, began to swing decisively in her favor. Avara's carefully crafted image as a fun, accessible brand started to crack. The corporation's response was swift and brutal. Their PR machine went into overdrive. They released a statement dismissing Ben's article as a one-sided and emotionally manipulative piece of fiction. They flooded social media with ads featuring a diverse group of smiling young people, with the tagline, "Avara, your style, your story." It was a cynical, calculated move to drown out her narrative with their own. Behind the scenes, their legal attack began in earnest. Marcus had warned her this would happen. Mounds of paperwork arrived at his office. Avara's lawyers from a top-tier firm called Sterling, Hewitt and Finch filed a motion to dismiss the case, claiming it was frivolous. They buried Marcus in discovery requests, demanding years of Alara's financial records, all her personal emails and text messages, even her art school transcripts. It was a classic tactic of intimidation and exhaustion. "They're looking for anything they can use to discredit you," Marcus explained over the phone, his voice grim. "They want to find a late tax payment, a snarky email to a friend, a bad grade in a design class, anything to paint you as unprofessional or unreliable." The invasion of privacy felt almost as violating as the theft of her design. Alara spent days combing through her own life, packaging it up for her enemies to inspect. The stress was immense. She wasn't sleeping. She could barely bring herself to enter her studio, the place that had once been her sanctuary. The Persephone dress, still on its mannequin, seemed to mock her with its silent beauty. One evening, as she was staring listlessly at a pile of legal documents, her phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering. "Alara, it's Julian Croft," the name sent a jolt through her. Julian had been her professor in a final-year design program, a mentor who had seen her potential and pushed her hard. He was a brilliant designer himself, known for his edgy architectural style. But a few years ago, he had taken a lucrative position as the head of a prestige sub-label for a major fashion conglomerate, a conglomerate that had recently been acquired by Avara. "Julian," she said, surprised. "How are you?" "I'm fine." "Listen, I've been following your situation," he said, his voice smooth and familiar. "It's a real mess. I'm sorry you're going through this." "Thanks," she said cautiously. "Look, I know the people at Avara. Not the top brass maybe, but I know how they operate. They're sharks, Alara. They don't lose. I'm just calling because I'm worried about you. This kind of fight, it can destroy a young designer's career before it even starts. You get a reputation for being difficult." A cold knot formed in Alara's stomach. "What are you saying, Julian?" "I'm saying you should be realistic," he said, his tone shifting from sympathetic to pragmatic. "You've made your point. The story is out there. Why not take that momentum and use it? If you were to, say, signal you're willing to talk, they might be open to a settlement. You could get a nice payout, enough to fund your brand for years. It's a win-win. You get your money, they make the bad press go away. It's not about the money, Julian." "They stole my work," he sighed, a sound of weary condescension she remembered from her student days. "They drew inspiration. It's a gray area, Alara, you know that. We all do it. Nothing is truly original. Don't be so naive. Take the win. Focus on your next collection. Don't let this one thing define you." After they hung up, Alara felt shaken. Julian had always been the voice of commercial pragmatism, the one who told her that art was all well and good, but you had to sell dresses to keep the lights on. He was presenting her with a tempting off-ramp, a way to escape the stress and the fear. His words planted a seed of doubt. Was she being naive? Was she sacrificing her entire future for a principle that no one in the industry actually cared about? The motion to dismiss was denied, a small victory that Marcus celebrated but warned was only the end of the first round. The next stage was depositions. Avara's lawyers wanted to question Alara under oath. The day of the deposition was one of the worst of her life. It took place in a sterile conference room at the offices of Sterling, Hewitt and Finch. Alara sat on one side of a long, polished table with Marcus. On the other side were three lawyers from Avara, led by a woman named Catherine Sterling, a senior partner who radiated a glacial, intimidating intelligence. For 6 hours, they questioned her. They were relentless. They picked apart her design process, questioned her timeline, and implied she had copied the pomegranate theme from a historical textile database that Avara's team also used. They brought up a C she had received in a history of fashion class in college, attempting to frame her as a mediocre student. They twisted her words, trying to trap her in contradictions. Avara did her best to remain calm, to stick to the facts as Marcus had coached her. But by the end of the day, she was emotionally raw, exhausted, and filled with self-doubt. They were so good at making her feel small, insignificant, and foolish. 2 weeks later, it was Avara's turn. Marcus was set to depose their head of design. But the day before, Catherine Sterling submitted a document that changed everything. It was a sworn affidavit from a junior designer at Avara, complete with a dozen digital sketches of the Underworld Bloom dress. The files were all time-stamped weeks before Avara had posted her work-in-progress photo. The sketches showed a clear, linear development process. The designer claimed she had been inspired by a trip to a museum exhibit on Greco-Roman art. It was a plausible, well-documented story. It was a complete fabrication, Avara knew, but it looked utterly convincing. They've created a parallel timeline, Marcus said, his face grim as he reviewed the documents. It's a lie, but it's a very good one. They're daring us to prove it. In a he said, she said battle, the billion-dollar corporation often gets the benefit of the doubt. The news broke online. Avara's PR team leaked the evidence to a friendly media outlet which ran the headline, Avara presents proof of independent creation in plagiarism case. The narrative began to shift again. The online trolls came out in force, gleefully proclaiming her a liar and a fraud. Even some of her supporters grew quiet, unsure of what to believe. The ground had fallen out from under her. For all her passion and righteous anger, she had no way to disprove their fabricated, time-stamped files. Her smoking gun, the anemone stitch, was still a secret. Marcus had advised her to hold it back, to save it as a final, unanswerable trump card if the case ever went to trial. But now it felt like they might never get theirs. They were losing the war of public opinion, and their legal case had just been torpedoed. That evening, Julian Croft called again. His tone was different this time. It wasn't the chiding mentor, it was the voice of a merciful victor. I saw the news, Avara, he said softly. I'm sorry. I told you they play hard. Avara was silent, staring at the wall of her studio. Listen, he continued, I spoke to some people. On your behalf. Because I still believe in your talent and I don't want to see it wasted. Avara is willing to make a formal offer. A settlement. It's generous, very generous. Enough to rent a real studio, hire a small staff, the works. All you have to do is sign an NDA. You agree not to speak about this ever again, and the lawsuit, the stress, it all goes away. It was the ultimate temptation. It was a golden door opening in the middle of a dark, terrifying labyrinth. She could take the money. She could walk away from the fight that was draining the life out of her. She could go back to what she loved, designing. All she had to do was let them get away with it. All she had to do was sign away her voice. They want me to admit I was wrong, she said, her voice hollow. They want it to be over, Julian corrected. And so should you. Think about it, Avara. This is your chance to get out of this with a massive win. Don't let pride get in your way. I'll have the offer sent to your lawyer in the morning. After the call, Avara felt a profound sense of isolation. The world she had tried to fight seemed to have won. The lie was more powerful than the truth. Her anger was gone, replaced by a bone-deep weariness. Maybe Julian was right. Maybe she was just being naive. What was the point of fighting for a principle if it meant losing everything else? She walked over to the Persephone dress and gently touched the fabric. She thought of her grandmother. What would she have done? Anemone had been a quiet woman, but she had possessed a core of unshakable integrity. She had never compromised on her craft, never taken the easy way out. Avara closed her eyes and thought about the anemone stitch. It was a secret. A flaw. A tiny hidden piece of her soul. Avara had copied the body of her work, but they had unknowingly copied that tiny piece of her soul, too. They had swallowed it whole, and they didn't even know it was sitting in their belly. The offer from Avara was a lifeline. But it was also a cage. If she took it, she would be safe, she would be secure, but she would never be free. The truth would be buried forever, and they would have successfully bought her silence. Her internal conflict raged. The fear of failure, the fear of being seen as a fraud, the fear that had always nipped at her heels was screaming at her to take the deal. But another voice, a quieter one that sounded a lot like her grandmother, whispered that some things weren't for sale. She sat on the floor of her studio all night, surrounded by the tools of her trade, the fabrics that were her palette, the dress that was her heart. By the time the sun rose, casting long shadows across the floor, she had made her decision. The fear was still there, but she had finally found something stronger, herself. The first thing Avara did the next morning was call Marcus. "I'm rejecting the offer," she said, her voice clear and steady. There was no hesitation. There was a pause on the other end of the line, then Marcus let out a low whistle. "That's a bold move, Avara. Are you sure this is the last off-ramp? They stole my work and they built a fortress of lies to cover it up," she said. "So I'm not going to take their money to help them hide the key. There's one thing they don't know about. It's time we told them." "The anemone stitch," Marcus said, a note of excitement entering his voice. "On the ace up your sleeve. Are you ready to play that card?" "I am." Their new strategy was audacious. They couldn't win the battle of digital forensics. Avara's fabricated timeline was too polished. They had to change the battlefield. They requested a final emergency deposition with Avara's head designer, a woman named Sylvie Renaud, and insisted on presenting new physical evidence. Avara's legal team, confident in their position, agreed, likely assuming it was a desperate last-ditch effort. But Avara had another call to make. She called Ben Carter. "I'm about to do something," she told him. "And I want the world to see it." The day of the deposition felt different. The air in the conference room was thick with Avara's arrogance. Catherine Sterling and her team of lawyers looked smug. Sylvie Renaud, the head designer, appeared bored, as if this were a minor nuisance keeping her from more important work. Avara entered with Marcus, her heart pounding but her hands steady. She carried a simple garment bag. Ben Carter, using a tip from a source inside the law firm, had already leaked the time and nature of the meeting. Several prominent fashion journalists and bloggers were live streaming from the lobby of the building, and the hashtag #Avara Showdown was trending. The deposition was technically private, but the world was metaphorically pressed against the glass. The meeting began with Catherine Sterling reiterating their position. "As the evidence we have provided clearly demonstrates," she said, her voice crisp, "Avara's design was conceived and executed entirely independently. MS. Vance's claims are baseless, and her continued pursuit of this matter is an act of bad faith harassment." Sylvie Renaud nodded in agreement, adding, "Inspiration is a fluid concept. The fact that two designers were inspired by similar classical motifs is hardly surprising." "It is certainly not theft," Marcus let them finish. Then he said, "We are not here today to discuss motifs or inspiration. We are here to discuss manufacturing." MS. "Renaud, could you please confirm that the Underworld Bloom dress was created based on the digital sketches provided in your evidence?" "Yes, of course," Sylvie said. "Our process is entirely digital from sketch to pattern making. It's how we maintain efficiency, so at no point did your team have access to MS. Vance's physical garment," Marcus pressed. "That's an absurd accusation," Catherine Sterling cut in. "Of course not." "Excellent," Marcus said, turning to Avara. "Avara, please." Avara stood up. She unzipped the garment bag and carefully removed two dresses. One was her silk Persephone dress. The other was Avara's polyester Underworld Bloom dress, which she had ordered online. She laid them side by side on the conference table. "MS. Renaud," Avara began, her voice gaining strength as she spoke. "You are correct. Inspiration is a fluid thing. A theme, a color, a silhouette, these can arise from the collective consciousness. But a fingerprint cannot." She picked up her own dress. A small, high-definition document camera was set up at the end of the table, connected to a large screen on the wall, a detail Marcus had insisted on. She placed the sleeve of her dress under the camera, zooming in on the seam. "In every piece I make, I sew a hidden signature," she explained, her voice echoing in the silent room. "It's a tribute to my grandmother, a seamstress. She taught me that true craftsmanship is in the details no one else sees. On the seventh stitch of every major seam, I manually create a tiny, deliberate imperfection. A loop in the lock stitch. I call it the anemone stitch." On the screen, magnified 100 times, the stitch was clear. A tiny, perfect loop, almost invisible to the naked eye but undeniable under the lens. The Avara lawyers exchanged confused glances. It's a charming story, MS. Vance, Catherine Sterling said dismissively. But it proves nothing, let's see, Avara said. She carefully removed her dress and replaced it with Avara's. She smoothed the cheap polyester fabric and moved the seam under the camera. Her heart was in her throat. This was the moment. Had their mass production process been sloppy enough, she found the seam on the bishop's sleeve. She counted the stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. A collective gasp went through the room. There on the screen, magnified for all to see, was the flaw. It was messier than hers, a snag in the thread from a high-speed industrial machine, but it was unmistakably there. A tiny loop on the 7th stitch. How? Sylvie Renaud whispered, her face draining of color. Avara looked directly at her. Because you can't create that flaw from a digital sketch. That mistake, she said, her voice ringing with the clarity of truth, could only be there if your factory had my physical dress. If they took it apart seam by seam to create a pattern. You didn't just copy my idea. You ripped my work to pieces and traced it. You traced my grandmother's memory. You traced my signature, silence. The smug confidence had evaporated from Avara's side of the table. Catherine Sterling's face was a mask of cold fury. They were caught. Their perfectly constructed fortress of lies had been brought down by a single misplaced thread. Marcus leaned forward. I believe this deposition is over, he said calmly. The aftermath was an inferno. Someone in the room had secretly recorded the exchange on their phone, and within an hour, the video of Avara's revelation was everywhere. It was a perfect, viral moment of justice. The quiet, determined artist exposing the corporate giant with a detail as elegant and irrefutable as DNA evidence. Avara's carefully managed PR narrative was shredded. Their stock price tumbled. The public outcry was deafening. They were not just thieves, they were clumsy, arrogant thieves. The story was no longer about a dress. It was about integrity, authenticity, and the stunning downfall of a corporate bully. The panicked call from Catherine Sterling to Marcus came less than 24 hours later. Her tone was no longer glacial, it was desperate. The settlement they now offered was worlds away from the hush money they had tried to push on her before. The final agreement was a landmark victory. Avara received a substantial financial sum, but more importantly, Avara was forced to issue a full, public apology, acknowledging her as the original designer of the Persephone dress. They had to pull the entire Mythos collection from their stores globally. And the part Avara was proudest of, the settlement stipulated the creation of the Anemone Fund, a multi-million-dollar foundation paid for by Avara to provide legal aid and support to independent designers fighting intellectual property theft. Months later, the scent of hot iron and lavender filled a much larger space. Avara now worked out of a bright, airy studio in a converted warehouse, with 2 long cutting tables and windows that overlooked the city. Orders for her collections were pouring in from boutiques all over the world. The Persephone dress, which she had finally released, was her bestseller. Ben Carter's blog had become a major voice in the industry, and their professional relationship had blossomed into a warm and supportive personal one. This afternoon, she was not alone. A young intern, a design student with wide, eager eyes, stood beside her at the sewing machine. Okay, Avara said, her voice patient and kind. Now I'm going to show you the most important part. It's not in the pattern. It's a secret. She guided the fabric under the needle, her movements sure and steady. She leaned in close, just as her grandmother had once done for her. On the 7th stitch, you just guide the thread. Like this. See? The intern stared in fascination at the tiny loop that appeared in the seam. What is it? Avara smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile that reached her eyes. Oh, it's a signature, she said. It's a reminder that the strongest things are often the parts of ourselves we think are too small to be seen. It's not a flaw. It's a mark of authenticity. It's a promise that what you're making is real. She leaned back, looking around her new studio at the sketches for her next collection already pinned to the wall. The fight had taken so much from her, but it had given her something far more valuable in return. She had faced down her deepest fears and had not only survived, she had transformed. She was no longer just a designer. She was the guardian of a legacy, an advocate for her craft, and the author of her own story, stitched together with strength, integrity, and a thread of unbreakable truth.